So I just wanted to say welcome, everyone, and thank you for being present here today. And I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Cathy May Kareise, a scholar and practitioner, change maker, and public speaker on issues of race, difference, and belonging. She's currently the DEI lead at the Mindfulness Initiative and the Systems Change lead at Resilience Capital Ventures. She's also the author of the new book, Disrupting White Mindfulness, Race and Racism in the Wellbeing Industry. The book engages with decolonizing initiatives rooted in embodied justice and offers a path and invitation for a radically transformed mindfulness, embracing solutions built on difference and on global South perspectives. So on that point, welcome again, Cathy May, and I will hand over to you. And Itumeleng, I think, who's in the room, will chair the session.
Thank you so very much. Itumeleng, am I going ahead or are you going ahead?
Cathy, I think you can go ahead. Good afternoon, everyone, and very warm welcome from all of us sitting here and online, Cathy. So you've got about 45 minutes to give the lecture, and then we'll open up for questions. Thanks, May. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm very grateful, and I'll share screen in a moment if I find the right button. But let me first say such a great thank you to Natasha for initiating this invitation, and to the School of Public Health for the invitation. It's such a delight and a pleasure to be here and to be presenting on my home soil. It's always a very emotional thing for me, being so far away, and I want to honor in the work that I'm about to present. I really want to honor the tremendous works underway in the many schools of public health, so that this is really a contribution about a small patch of work and how it materializes in the context of public health in South Africa. And I will, when we get to that point, acknowledge that my comrades in arms some of them are in the room, and so that when we have questions about the practical manifestation of this work, there is a community of people who are able to engage on this. So I'll start by walking you through the presentation. And let me get the right one. I think I've got the right one. I think I need to do that button, and we're ready to go. So as you've seen, we're looking at decolonizing well-being and addressing race and racism in the well-being industry. I'm hoping that I am able to, if the connection goes, that I will switch off my camera at any point. So please just holler, Natasha, if it would be better for me to do that. And so let me start with Audre Lorde to say that, you know, she guides a lot of my work, certainly, and a lot of the thinking around issues of decolonizing, especially when it comes to the inner landscape. And of course, we all know her words of the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. But I want to add these additional parts of her phrasing, where she says racism, and I think today we would say transphobia, are real conditions of all our lives. And when we drop in and we touch the terror and the loathing of any difference that lives inside us, her call, her encouragement is that we actually see very closely whose face it wears. So my work, the presentation is going to be based on this book, Disrupting White Mindfulness, and it has 3 parts. And again, I want to acknowledge that, you know, single names go on books, but we all know that these works come out of tremendous community, conversations, gatherings, collectives, interchanges, etc. So just to acknowledge all the conversations, and as I say, with some of the people present as well. The first part that I'll present is on the roots of exclusion and othering, and then I'll look very briefly at my research and some of the results, just so that we can look at what this means in practical terms. And then I'll shift gear into part 3, which is very practical and focuses on the wonderful, awesome program which is present in the Western Cape of South Africa at the moment. So we'll get there. It's a good place to start with this diagram, which was developed by Alan Grigg and Generation 5 to remember that ecosystems shape and mark and condition us. And when I'm talking about marking, we know that things are scribbled on and inside our bodies. So the ways in which we are conditioned, the conditions in which we live and into which we are born, all of these shape how we become in society. So these ecosystems all have an impact on us. But of course, what the diagram is saying is that we equally, these are sites of change, and we equally can change ecosystems and social systems. So to sketch the framing of the research and of the talk, we know that race and multiple characteristics of difference, class, gender, are used to fuel divisions. Divide and rule strategies are designed to create fear, insecurities, and vulnerabilities. I want to emphasize this, that divide and rule regimes actually exploit difference to create vulnerabilities. And we're not only talking about structural harms, we're talking about the inner landscape of our lives as well. There is growing precarity, and we'll get that later on. So the work that we're doing out of these conditions says that when we are changing systems, we have to change ourselves. That in societies that are so very hyper-individualized, we feel completely separate and isolated from one another, even when we are living alongside one another. And so when we are changing and building systems differently, if we are not changing in the process, that mode of hyper-individualism actually perpetuates. And finally here is to say that systems change has to be all of our work. It cannot be some people's work and not others. These are systems that we all are living in together. And this is a diagram really to show that as we become more invested in changing systems, and as we become more changed, these orbs actually start interrelating more, overlapping more and more, so that this world that we are wanting to see becomes the life that we are living. We actually are manifesting it in everything that we are doing, and so the circles come closer. I really hope that makes sense to people, that we're not talking about individual change outside of systems change, and we're not talking about systems change outside of individual change. Reverend Angel Kyodo Williams, of course, says this really well, that love and justice are not two things, that without inner change, there can be no outer change, and without collective change, no change matters. And I actually want to introduce something here about friendship, so that when we speak about collective change, we are also understanding that we're talking about, we are in South Africa use the word comrades, we are talking about friendship. And just to name at the moment that friendship and free have the same root, which means to love. We cannot become free outside of friendships and outside of community. So the first part, the roots of exclusion and othering, we will all be familiar with the fabric of settler colonial societies and the ways in which power becomes distorted in these contexts. So there's an exercise of power over. There is a hideous distortion of people's lives. So we know that settler colonialism fixed power in such ways as to put in place, to establish a slave trade and slavery, to establish through using Western science through using eugenics to justify mental superiority and degradation. Edward Said's work in this regard is, of course, very helpful because this concept of othering allows us to understand that these mental models rooted in colony and empire, of course, persist. You know, when structures change in decolonizing contexts, the mental models don't necessarily change. Said, of course, refers to this as latent Orientalism. And we're talking here about, in the contexts of colony and empire, the appropriation, the extraction of cultural knowledges, of wealth, of controls of people. And when knowledges become extracted, we're talking about these powers that do the extraction representing these knowledges as universal. And we'll see how this plays out in relation to research paradigms. So if we're looking at how whiteness is cemented in these societies, we understand that structurally it is based on systemic exclusions, that whiteness and white supremacy, whenever they are present, they exercise power over by skewing access to education, housing, mortgages, work, finance, services, and justice. That whiteness articulates with other ideologies, so works alongside ideologies and systems of racial capitalism, neoliberalism, and post-racialism. And we know the concept of racial capitalism was, of course, coined in South Africa, and we've always understood the intersectional nature of how vulnerabilities are created for the global majority in South Africa, and even more so for some communities within the global majority. And that, of course, is also part of a divide and rule strategy. And I just want to notion here this myth of shareholder primacy, that we can get caught up with myths that actually are not even legislated. So shareholder primacy claims that shareholders need to get the largest stake and need to benefit from racial capitalism. But in fact, there is nothing legislating that. So all of these can be challenged. Neoliberalism, we appreciate, is creating increasing precarity and dispossession. And of course, that means also dispossession in relation to the right to work. Healthism and medicalization are important because, as is well known in the works that you do, these systems tend to divorce conditions from their rootedness in socioeconomic and political injustices. And so obviously the work of public health is to re-establish those linkages. Post-racialism, we know well, it is the grandchild of the melting pot theories, color blindness, race relations, multiculturalism. And of course, when any noise is made about race, the problem of race, as Sarah Ahmed tells us, the people who make the noise, us, become the problem. So she's written, we become the complainant, becomes the problem, and she's written this book in 21 called Complaint. And so I'm really concerned with the ideology of whiteness, with these mental models and dominant narratives that persist. We know well the message of our beloved Steve Biko, that the most potent weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And that unless, as Marcus Garvey says and Bob Marley sings, unless we emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, we cannot free our minds. So this business of mental models and dominant narratives of white normativity and white spaces, I want to suggest lives on way beyond, and it kind of lives in the interstitial tissues of society, and it exercises power over, and that means that we find ourselves in some situations assuming that relationality of power over or of feeling inferior or not recognizing ourselves in the ways in which society is structured. So the cultures of whiteness that are pervasive include the fact that these cultures become embodied and that we perpetuate this practice of othering, that it's actually a practice in divide and rule societies, settler colonial societies and colonial societies. And the business of decolonizing has to get us into those very sticky and interstitial spaces. I need to constantly find my mouse to press the next slide. So thank you for bearing with me. South Africa, of course, has an incredible history of resistance. And most recently, we've seen this through the fallist movements. And I'm using this to note that resistance takes many, many forms, and that when we speak about whiteness marking and controlling bodies, that we're speaking about what Ray Johnson calls 1,000 paper cuts. It's not only about skewed access and provisions. It's about the fact that these paper cuts are made all the time. They're markings on the body. And there is an expectation of resilience that people simply live through adversity. So of course, whiteness invisibilizes privilege, and it would be good to come back to this later on. And the markers with which race intersects to create vulnerabilities we know are sex, gender, class, ableism, etc. And that all of this rests on hyper-individualism. So moving a little bit more quickly, Linda Tuhiwai Smith wrote this amazing book in 1999, which we will know well, Decolonizing Methodology. And I wanted to pick out again from her text this way in which knowledges are extracted, the ways in which we can continue to do research in an extractive way. The collective memory of imperialism was knowledges were collected, classified, and then represented in various ways back to the West, and then through the eyes of the West back to those who have been colonized. And we understand here, we can hear the words of Toni Morrison in terms of the white gaze. Cognitive and epistemic justice in the case of decolonizing methodologies, of course, becomes hugely important, that we are sure that we are hearing silenced voices and narratives, that we are leveraging difference and doing things differently, that we're learning through multiple intergenerational wisdoms, and that we're cultivating power with and power within. So, quick overview of the part 2, which is really my research, which happens across 3 very large organizations that function globally, but these organizations are located, they have their hubs in the US and the UK. And to frame this part, to note that Timnit Gebru took this picture in 2015. And the idea behind this picture, I'm just checking if anybody is trying to reach me on WhatsApp, but I think we are all good. The idea behind this picture is these white men are now called, and I'm using quotes for those who can't see me, the godfathers of AI. AI, we know through Gebru's work as well as Bolamwini, is that AI uses facial recognition software in which bias is embedded. So in other words, AI cannot recognize black faces, and these women, these black women, have come together to show how these biases are implicit not only in the software, but we can then extrapolate and say in many other sectors and systems. Bell Hooks, I won't read the quote, but we appreciate that she's talking about who tend to be the bearers of power over, not the knowledge bearers, but the bearers of power over. So very quickly, key features of white mindfulness. Spaces are white, power is white. We end up with pedagogies that produce one-size-fits-all models. We see in the next slide that when it comes to the decision making within these organizations, there ain't no people of the global majority or from marginalized communities, but we have these white savior tropes that perpetuate. And let me just say very quickly here, when we do deep systems work within these communities, white-bodied people, I'm not saying all white-bodied people, but white-bodied people in power who've enjoyed the privileges of these systems cannot relate, cannot see their privilege and cannot see what changes they need to make in systems. So this work is deep and it's slow work, as we'll see. Very quickly, interesting that when we see the difference between directorship and people who are actually teaching these courses, it becomes white women who are doing the graft on the ground, but of course the decision making resides mainly with white men. Pedagogies in these contexts, of course, are uncritical and are called apolitical in order to not have to deal with these social chasms, inequalities, tensions, dilemmas that we have in society. And I won't speak to the rest of this slide, but to say that when we are functioning in these worlds, you know, where whiteness is in the corridors of power, where whiteness is perpetuated, it's in the air that we are breathing, we have to ask how we are being shaped. What are the social norms and defaults? What are the methodologies that we are using? Who models success and you know, great publication and that sort of thing? And do we feel a sense of belonging, as we know is a big issue for many people in South Africa? Right, so moving now into what is the more exciting part of this presentation, and hopefully we'll have a little bit more time and I won't have to rush quite as much. So this part is really about recognizing that when we are talking about systems change, we know that this picture, which is now a familiar picture, functions at the structural level of change that we need. We've, you know, in South Africa may even have introduced the language of the distinction between equality and equity and redress, and understanding that justice is not one thing, that we are constantly unraveling what it is that we mean by justice and what it is that we mean by liberation, because society is constantly evolving and changing. But we understand that there's a trajectory of this work of decolonization that is leading us towards notions of liberation. But we want to remember, and this is Prentice Hemphill, and I usually promote her podcast called Finding Our Way, because it deals so sensitively with this side of systems change, deep systems change and decolonization. The kind of change we are after is cellular as well as institution, is personal and intimate, is collective as well as cultural. We are making love synonymous with justice. So here we see very much the action component of the ways in which we are shaping, you know, to go back to that early visual, ways in which we are shaping our future, our systems, and of course the present, right? We're not talking about something that is yet to come. And so within this work, embodied liberation really becomes the cornerstone of this work, that we're talking about cultivating a quality of presence that nourishes power within, that uses the lens of intersectionality, that leverages difference, and that cultivates radical belonging, radical love, and radical joy. When we are in the business of liberating bodies, minds, and collectives, we understand that we are embracing knowledges, skills, talents, and wisdom from within these collectives to make change. The solutions are not coming out from outside the spaces where these knowledges reside. And so in this work, we are very much honoring Global South, Indigenous, intergenerational and queer voices and knowledges. And we're almost flipping the script so that there's a much greater appreciation of diving into what is it that we bring to shaping these environments. And I'm coming back to Audre Lorde just one more time to remember this encouragement. Touch the terror and loathing of any difference inside ourselves. So processes of decolonization do this very deep systems change work. I've included the slide on radical compassion because the word compassion is used very liberally in many circles, and that may be the case only in the global north at the moment. But it's to recognize that compassion, of course, sits on top of empathy. And this diagram is developed by the Nielsen Norman group, who are like organizational psychologists and who are very user-focused in the work that they do with businesses. And they don't go as far as what I'm proposing, but they certainly do recognize in compassion that when we relate to people as independent actors rather than objectify people, there is room for compassion. That compassionate action means we respect people's own purposes, desires, needs, knowledge, skills, talents, and wisdoms. And I repeat these words over and over and over again, so that we don't forget that we are sitting on gold mines in terms of how much we bring to society. That compassion means that people forgo thinking, so this is talking about that white savior trope, forgo thinking that people ought to do what they think people ought to do, that we don't impose our priorities or preferences on people, that we act really from a place of power with and power within. And so my addition to this notion of compassion is that compassion isn't only I am moved by you. Compassion must mean that this engagement and this interaction changes me. Compassion, radical compassion, has to mean that I become changed in the engagement. And if we extrapolate from that, systems change then is about compassion for communities. Organizations have to change in the process of community work. And so we're speaking about a very dynamic way of seeing these ecosystems as living ecosystems. A young bell hooks tells us that communities sustain life. It is not nuclear families or the couple, and as she says, certainly not the rugged individualist who sustain life. There is no better place to learn the art of loving than in community. So I want to return to this point of the nature of community. That community in these terms is that place that offers rest and refuge. Community is the place where we are cultivating friendship. Community is the place where we potentially can map and manifest our freedom together. This is very much my freedom is tied up with yours. I cannot be free unless you too are free. It is very much this language and thinking. And then very quickly, what does centering systems impacted people mean? It means, of course, the deep listening, the thinking and designing from this perspective, the understanding positionalities so that we don't assume any objectivity in the research process. It means citing people of the global majority and marginalized voices, and naming the causes and conditions of diseases and health, including, of course, physical and mental health, when these go out of kilter. It means practicing cognitive and epistemic justice and asset framing so that we avoid deficit language and we continue to center those knowledges, skills, and talents and wisdom, that we avoid language that dehumanizes people, and that we build and hone research methods that center Indigenous, people of the global majority, and queer narratives, and that we cultivate and nourish collaboration opportunities. So really that is about widening the solutions space constantly. So this is the wonderful program that my people are in the house. The people who I work with on this program are in the house, and it's called Awesome, so that our graduates can say, I'm an awesome graduate. It's a wellness leaders program. It is something developed in partnership between Chrysalis Academy, Clear Mind International, and the Telcom Foundation Adopt a Project. And these are the different kinds of roles that were played in bringing this collaborative together, that Chrysalis looked after the governance, the administration, the logistics, the home, provided the home and the hub for our residentials, provided all of that logistical work in allowing us to actually have a home. The Telcom Foundation provided the catalytic funding, and I'll come back to what I'm meaning with catalytic funding so that we can have some conversation around that. Clear Mind International, the educational architecture. So bearing in mind that none of this is possible without that seed funding and that seed grant, we understand that the project really is and it emerges out of this collaboration and this synergy and this partnership. We understand the purpose very much as a holistic community-based wellness program for young people in South Africa and beyond. It's very much a model that can be scaled way beyond South Africa, but this really was our place of being able to run the program together for the first time. So the methodology we use is very much somatics based in terms of practices and lenses, but we are constantly aware of the work being trauma informed, being mental health focused, being about healing and about thriving. So we're understanding the space that we are using with a very deliberate vision that we build with participants. And the values are, of course, the values of transformative agency, that these participants are the agents of change. They are the agents of bringing about embodied freedom, social justice, embodied justice, that we are exercising and practicing collective power, deliberate radical joy and radical love. So this is a radically different approach to public health that is certainly not disease focused, and of course community health isn't disease focused, but it's a pathway and an avenue that actually is part of creating health, public health within the communities where we work. So a big part of this work in terms of this power within and the power with is this understanding of standing in our power. The notion that this is not something that can be given to us or handed out, that we are dropping into and understanding and cultivating power within and power with one another. And may I say that, you know, the neuroscientists are understanding increasingly that when we speak about self-regulation, and I'm going to say when we speak about power within, this is not something that we can cultivate in isolation of community. So the neuroscientists understand that self-regulation relies on co-regulation, that it is not something that can happen independently of co-regulation. So this is a blended program, and we can speak more about the details later if people are interested. Participants become awesome wellness leaders, and graduates become the future trainers of future cohorts. These are just some of our people. On the previous slide, you saw us at one of the in-person retreats for those who are still present. So the content includes deep transformation work, plus somatics, as I've said, including yoga, movement, mindfulness, and it is very much includes community building, guidance and education, as well as meeting our money mindsets. And these were really popular components of the program, that we're really wanting to expose all of these mental models that we hold on the inside, that of course become the inner trappings that we end up living with. So embodied justice and radical love, some of what we're encouraging within these communities, or some of the things that we worked with, were leaning into possibility, imagination and dreams, all premised of course on deep listening, remembering our ancestors, remembering this notion that we work in a way where we have got one another's backs, that we have ancestors who have our backs, that we can dream the next generations and know that we have their backs, that we are deliberately cultivating joy, leveraging, again we see the knowledge, skills and wisdom, that we're cultivating power within, that we are co-creating and collaborating. Participants' voices guided the content of the architected pedagogy, and this is a really important component, that the program was very, very responsive to the conversations and what was coming from participants as we work together. And some of our non-negotiable principles and values included are very premised on this notion of justice is love in action. So living our values in how we work, looking outward and joining up at communal and in communal and sustainable change. And why this is important is because there were so many talents and knowledges. There are, I should say, so many talents and knowledges in our group. We have permaculturalists, we have barefoot runners, we have people who know about the land, we have musicians, there are so many. We have people who know about food and living healthily. And so all of this becomes part of this vision of changing the ways in which we are approaching health, but obviously stronger together. Let me move on to speak about what we are learning. So this work is patient and cannot be rushed. It is responsive, emergent, and generative. There is a lot that arises that is completely unexpected, and that cannot be planned for. So innovation, we are learning, comes from this rich soil of our coming together and the deep work that we do together. Pieces of the puzzle fall in place in ways that we could not have imagined before the program started, right? So there's something about the emergence in this work which suggests that we have to get deep and low and get into these mental models in order to arrive at this much deeper friendship, connecting collective. People's narratives were an essential part of the program. So we asked everyone to present to us themselves, and people put together these amazing slideshows and presentations that were incredibly moving, and many, if not all of them, said, we've never been asked to do this before. And that shaped, of course, many conversations that then unfolded, and many actions and many deep dives. There is a great thirst for this work midst life happening. So we've had a couple of babies on the course, we've had people having to take a break and etc. So lots evolving. Just by the way, this picture on the lower left-hand quadrant is a dance that our community created together as a gift to us. Participants need support, mentoring and coaching, and this is another important layer of the work, that the work can be deeply transforming and healing for people and for intergenerational communities. So catalytic capital funds people that are patient, that are risk tolerant, that unlock investments, that expand opportunities, strengthen communities and fuel innovation. When we bring capital to communities in this way, we actually are laying the ground for larger investments. So this work is deeply restoring and enriching, and it means that communities participate more and more fully in the work of bigger projects. There is much more involvement in visioning, in decision making, etc., for when other forms of capital come in. Catalytic capital allows us to do this deep work so that we can harness all the capitals that are non-financial, the knowledge, the social, relational, cultural, academic, entrepreneurial, and the wisdom capital, all of the capitals that exist within our communities. All of these can become harnessed in this period of this deep transformation work. And Awesome, of course, fits this model of laying the ground for more to evolve. So I want to draw to a close with this poem by Danai Mupotsa, who works, I think, currently maybe at Wits University. And it's a very stirring poem, which I think may mean different things to each of us. But it reminds us that justice cannot be given, that it won't be given, I should say, it won't be given. It is heartache wrapped in pretty paper, offered with cheap sentiment from friends who own land. And so it reminds us again of this important work of cultivating power within, of transcending the boundaries of those very limiting, oppressive mindsets and mental models that Steve Biko tells us about, and of moving forward very differently in the ways in which we create justice, power with, and justice within our communities. And of course, this notion of being free together, this notion of friendship, this notion of friendship and freedom having the same root, which means to love, is encased in Nelson Mandela's words of, to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. So Awesome is giving expression to Ubuntu, is allowing us to feel our way into how we might understand and create public health within our communities. And that, people, is my time. I am now, I'm hoping, still with you.
Thank you so much, Cathy. You're still very much with us, and see a big round of applause from the people in the room as well.
Thank you kindly.
Can I open the floor for questions? Perhaps I can begin with the colleagues in the room, and then we can go online. Online. Welcome. Any questions? Any comments?
And may I just say, while people are thinking of their questions and comments, I think we have on the call Lucille Mayer, Janine Turner, Shafika Isaacs, who are all leaders of the Awesome program. So so we have a collective of people who could answer in those regards. But please.
Thanks, Cathy. Do the colleagues want to perhaps add to what you have presented, or just share some of their reflections?
I'm calling on these colleagues. I cannot see you, but it would be wonderful to hear from you. Alex Dafu, thank you.
Hi there. Thanks so much. I hope I'm audible. So that was really fantastic presentation, and I think it's an important conversation as we're sort of thinking about wellness, within the institution, within the School of Public Health. I had a question around sort of, I think, this tension between mindfulness practices and body-based practices and awareness. And I wanted to sort of get your thoughts on that, and maybe any, activities that you might have engaged in. So you mentioned sort of the dance at the end as well, in terms of being more body-based awareness to kind of well-being practices as well. And then, sorry, a second question is just, I think also this tension between kind of those in power, who, as you mentioned, are often sort of maybe white male, and you want leaders to sort of be engaged and value well-being practices within the institution, but sometimes I think they can be in two minds about how to position themselves relative to that process. And I wonder if you have any thoughts and advice around the positionality of those in power relative to kind of these practices of well-being in an institution like the UCT, for example. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for those questions. And I'm going to come back to the second one, but let me start with the first. So our work is very somatics based. It has to involve the body in whatever forms of movement, and it may be via dance, it may be via yoga, it may be via micro movements. So what somatics practitioners are finding is that, the saying, as the saying goes, the issues are in the tissues, right? That a lot of this stuff lives inside us at a cellular level. And when we do big yoga moves, they don't necessarily unblock and dislodge those kinds of those 1,000 paper cuts that I spoke about earlier. So the micro movements, the dance, the joy, joy has its own movement, right? The energies of the body move in a particular way. All of this, and I mean, we have that rhythm of South Africa. All of this becomes incredibly important in processes of healing. So I hope that starts addressing that question around the importance of movement, but especially joy, micro movements, and then of course the bigger movements, which is a good place to get people engaged with. Mindfulness usually works with movement. So mindfulness is not separate from movement, but remember that we tend to think of mindfulness as this just noticing and just being with ourselves. It's not particularly action oriented, and it's not social justice based. So what is happening increasingly in mindfulness circles that are looking at issues of systems change is that when you have a mindfulness that is focused on social justice, you have the group pulling along. But many mindfulness circles in the global north are white middle class circles. So I'm going to have to ask you, and I think maybe we should take Mohammed's question first, Alex, but I'm going to have to ask you again about that power over question, because let me say very quickly, these works are becoming more and better known in corporates as well, right? This notion that we need spaces within our institutions for this kind of work. And we need those people who are in positions of power, just like you need the people in positions of power to endorse systems change. You need them to also participate in the practices themselves, because that's what starts changing the narrative, the dynamic within the institution, the engagement, the freedom, the space. It starts changing the spaces, and we need spaces where we can start solving together and innovating together. I hope that's enough, Alex. I can see Mohammed, Jibe's hand up.
Hi, thank you very much for that very wonderful presentation. And could you perhaps elaborate a little bit on the link between decolonizing well-being and transformation as it is currently being practiced in South Africa, and how does transformation advance or prevent decolonized well-being? Thanks. I hope that's clear.
I hope so too, Mohammed. I'm gonna have a go, and then we see how we go. You know, Mohammed, I think, and I appreciate what's lying underneath your question, that we talk decolonization, but it can easily become a word where we're talking about structures and processes on the outside, and we talk, but we're not necessarily manifesting sufficient material change that supports the inner work. So when we're talking transformation, it has to, and I'm suggesting the same with decolonization. We have to be talking about inner landscapes, this deep systems change work that, let me say, is very uncomfortable work. It takes us out of our comfort zones. And I want to honor, I didn't get to say this in the presentation, I appreciate there is so much decolonization work happening within public health. I've seen a number of papers written. I know that your school has lectures on it. So I'm wanting really to honor that. But I'm suggesting that the transformation component really allows us to do things differently, like in the awesome process. I feel like I'm not really answering you, Mohammed, but I hope that starts a conversation. And of course, Lucille, Shafika, I don't know if you're here, Janine, anybody else, it would be good to hear other views on this question that you are posing, unless there are other questions coming up.
Could I just follow up your response? I mean, I think that what you have described, let me put it to you this way. In the school and in spaces, in higher education institutions, while there may be broader macro changes, one of the big challenges remains the institutional culture.
Yes.
And so I can see some kind of interfacing of what you speak about,
yes,
contributing towards the institutional culture.
Yes.
When you talk about, this overlap between personal change and systemic change or systems change, because I think that's where we are. One of the kind of spaces or the challenges that we face in the school is how do we enhance the institutional culture such that it is kind of epitomizes the kind of principles and that you spoke about. Thanks.
Absolutely, Mohammed. Thank you for making that even more explicit. So we're speaking about these mental models from settler colonial societies where those cultures, and I don't know what language is used in South Africa at the moment, but so I'm going to use the language of those cultures of those colonial mental constructs, the cultures of whiteness actually perpetuate, right? Long after structural systems change. So the importance of this work at an institutional level cannot be undermined, but it does mean, that's why I'm saying leadership has to buy into these processes for them to be endorsed and sponsored. But even where leadership doesn't do it, we do it ground up, right? we form circles. I mean, this happens in many institutions. We form circles where we start doing, the gender reconciliation work, where we start doing the understandings of how our bodies are being marked with those 1,000 paper cuts on a daily basis, where we start doing the work of unpacking what the institutional harms are that are still perpetuated in the name of change. So I think those spaces, we want to create those spaces if they are not provided. But any institution that is going to make the kinds of changes that come from apartheid South Africa into the current dispensation without doing this work, we actually are making change with the head and absolutely nothing happening in the heart. No change happening in the heart of the institution. So all those old patterns of disrespect, of degradation, of putting people down, of shouting, I've heard, some not good stories. And, this, as long as this is happening, it is our feedback to know that change, fundamental change, is not underway. Is this getting more to your question, Mohammed?
Yes, because sorry, it's becoming a little bit like I'm asking too many questions. So if there's anybody
question,
wants
Mohammed. Oh yes, you were asking them. Sorry to interrupt you.
Okay, so if there aren't any, one of the questions that came up is, what does mental health got to do with transformation? And
right.
And so for the first time, I'm beginning to understand much better the kind of concepts that you posed in terms of decolonizing well-being, because traditionally mental health is very medicalized, for want of a better word.
Yes.
And so when you're talking about well-being or mental well-being, it's all about engaging with the concepts that you have just presented. And as you indicate, it's very awkward, it's very kind of, you have to name it, but that is the hard work that needs to be done in order for us to be able to work and relate to each other in community, in the school, for example, within divisions, within the entire school, because that is really, in my mind, where the next kind of frontier, as it were, that's what we need to unpack, and what kind of processes and tools do we have, as you've posited some of them now today, to enable us to do that? Thanks.
So beautiful. Thank you so much, Mohammed. And I can see the seeds for this work very much alive within the school and within various departments. And just to add to what you're saying, we've got to start somewhere, right? Or we've got to pick up the threads to continue from what has been started. It is the underlying foundations of how we work together. And if we, as you say, if we don't attend to it, we're lost. We're actually lost, and we'll be in the same situation 5-10 years down the line with a much more serious climate and other problems on our hands. Thank you, Mohammed.
Thanks, Cathy. I think we've got one last comment from Professor Kareise. So thank you so much, Cathy. I was really struck by the insight that many mindfulness programs claim to be apolitical, and also that the training in the programs does not enable constructive critique. How best do we navigate this, or how best to navigate this in your homework? I think, Sue, you had your hand up. Is that covered?
Yeah. Hi, Cathy May. I did put my question in the chat, and then I put my hand up, and then I put it down because I was concerned we were running out of time. And Just you can read it there, but just to try to articulate the question I'm trying to ask, if I can get it right, is that, for example, I'm part of a coaching sort of grouping, and in that coaching kind of a grouping, there's sort of almost rules of how one engages, and somebody has to set those rules. So here's my discomfort. Who gets to set the rules? How does this avoid becoming just the same as, I thought, your very valid critique of some of the mindfulness programs? So if the rule is no interrupting, how does one then engage with who gets to make that rule, and how do you critique that rule? And
yeah, and I think, like Mohammed, Susan, you're saying this is a process. It's not a quick fix. These are not quick fixes, but the ways we have worked in Awesome, we create those rules together. So it's not something that becomes imposed. It's very easy to call a space safe, but for many people, it may not feel safe. So the only way we can make it safe is by people being in the space and saying, these are my needs and these are my fears in this space. I mean, we can look around as there are many, many people who are extremely fearful and vulnerable because of these patterns of power over. So in the mindfulness sector, there is no engagement with critical race theory or with critical theory, which is why we end up with these beliefs of a deficit model and people needing to be told how to live their lives, right? So there are problems that are bedded in. It's in the very body of these structures, these organizations. That's what's embodied. It's what I call the whiteness, which we understand is not only about race. It's about all of those other things. But let me say, and this is also to you, Mohammed, when we do this work, there is a huge amount of resistance. And we have to navigate how we move through resistance so that we don't recenter whiteness and just deal with white tears, right? So we have to navigate things like white fragility, for instance, people feeling, because of course we're disrupting power, we're disrupting the way things are. So there's a lot of education that happens with this work. But what I want to say to you, Susan, because we don't have time, is it is all perfectly possible. It's all perfectly possible. So I want to really leave people with that practicalities of Awesome and the practicalities of doing this work with boards, with corporates, with people at so many different levels. It is possible. Not necessarily easy, but we are uncomfortable and we're making progress. I hope that's okay, Susan. I feel like I'm going to be cut off any minute.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Cathy, for an awesome presentation. I think it gives us food for thought as well in the school and the faculty at large. I think this is a presentation that really is due for the faculty and university as a whole. Thank you so much, Natasha, for organizing the session as well. And please, if you could just give us a very 2-minute feedback in the chat. We've dropped a link for what could be improved upon and future sessions that we would have from the Transformation Committee. So Cathy, thank you again we can't have virtual flowers to give you, but we will send them by email. Thank you again.
Oh, thank you so very much. All my gratitude to you. I'm hugely grateful, sis. So all of my heart is with you. Many thanks.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.